Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's great to be here, and hopefully this will be the start of a long series of interesting events on open data and Data 2.0. Let's start by doing quick introductions. I'll go first. My name is Chris Perry. I'm the producer of SF Beta. I'm a fellow with Creative Commons, and I'm working on the Data 2.0 conference today as the program chair. So let's just go down the line, and everyone just please give a quick intro, and then we can get started.
I'm John Voss, founder of lookbackmaps.net, and I'm also organizing the International Linked Open Data in Libraries, Archives, and Museums Summit happening here in San Francisco
we're going to eat into the morning break a bit,
in June.
and then also into the lunch a bit.
Hi, I'm Kevin Merritt, founder and CEO of Socrata, and Socrata has an open data platform that powers about 25 open data sites around the country.
Hi, I'm Dan O'Neill. I'm a co-founder of Everyblock.com. We're a neighborhood news website in 16 cities, and we have news and discussion and community, and basic mission is to help people make their block a better place.
Hi, my name is Jay Nath. I'm the Director of Innovation for the City and County of San Francisco, and I've led our open data efforts here in San Francisco, as well as our open API efforts, and a whole bunch of other good stuff.
Thanks very much. So let's start with two very simple questions. What open data is out there right now, and what is possible with that data? So to answer those questions, I'd like Kevin and Jay to first talk about the data that is out there right now, since both of you are helping make that possible. And then John and Dan, if you'd like, after that, to talk about what you're doing with that data.
So I'll start about San Francisco, and then I think, Kevin, you can give a kind of more holistic overview of the open data movement, since you work with a lot of cities and state and federal governments. So in San Francisco, we started in August of 2009, and the idea really came about when we saw President Obama release the transparency memo on his first day in office, and data.gov came into fruition a few months after that. And for us, that was a really, really important point. And we thought, you know, there's a lot of great data that we have here in San Francisco that we should be sharing as well. And let's take the same concept and apply it to San Francisco. So we launched datasf.org in August of 2009, and actually a lot of what we had done, you know, these guys over here had actually been the pioneers and kind of laid the groundwork for us. And we took that as a starting point, and today we have nearly 200 data sets and over 60 applications from, you know, mobile device apps, websites, analysis, a whole bunch of great stuff from our community. So we're now more of a facilitator rather than a creator, service delivery oriented organization. And I think that's really what's been important for us, is that government doesn't always have to fill that gap between you know, producing something and to the end consumer. That can actually be mediated by great folks like yourself, the talent in our community. So that's one of, I think, the big lessons learned from this initiative.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is open data is a movement at all three levels of government here within the U.S. So certainly data.gov is the anchor tenant of the open data and transparency movement. But what we've seen follow suit is, I think, 20 or 23 states now, like the states of Oregon and Washington and Oklahoma, now have open data portals. I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 or 25 cities, like City of Seattle and San Francisco and the District of Columbia, Baltimore, New York City, Chicago. Most major cities are either already sharing significant amounts of their data or have plans to do so in the not too distant future. County governments are doing it as well. We're seeing a lot of activity up north of the border in Canada. So this is a fairly global, fairly far-reaching movement to share all sorts of information. And the interesting perspective that we have providing a platform for many of these organizations is the kinds of data that they share tends to differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So the the ones that have been doing it the longest, like the District of Columbia, have fairly significantly automated their workflow processes so that most of their transactional data just works its way onto the data portal, whereas more organizations who are just entering this world are thinking about how to export data from legacy systems and systems of record, how to put it on their open data portal, and then from there we'll make the steps to start to automate those processes to keep the transactional data up to date. So it's all over the map, from things like FOIA requests in Chicago to expenditure data in New York City to lots of GIS and geospatial data at the national level in data.gov.
I'll just add on some. I'm not in the government space, but in the libraries, archives, and museum space, and sort of expanding the idea of open data from what we originally saw in the data.gov space to Smithsonian, Library of Congress, federal institutions, down to the state and local level. And one example of how we're starting to use that data is with the Civil War sesquicentennial coming up here. It starts in April 15th or so, I think. We'll start to combine federal and state archives and library entries. So we're looking at photographs from the New York 95th Regiment, for instance, might be held at Library of Congress, might be held at the New York Military Museum, and starting to build apps and games so that you can start to engage with those holdings and add more value to them as we go. And that's a 4-year process starting here in April.
Okay.
So the second part of your question, Chris, was, given the data that's out there, what can people do with it?
Yep.
At every block, we do something really simple. So we take the public data, and we work in 16 cities, and we're only interested in municipal government data. And we take it and we do something very simple. We just place it on a map and allow you to see new things near you. So you can see building permits, restaurant inspections, crime reports. You can get it by email. You basically have a feed for your block, and we break it down to the block level, not to the neighborhood level, not to the zip level, but you could see only what's going on your city block. So that's what we did for the first couple years of our existence, and just recently, about a week and a half ago, we relaunched our site, because what we were finding was that there was communities being built around the data. And our site is now much more focused on building community and allowing people to, make their block a better place. And to help answer the question, and I think we come across this question quite a bit in open data. So what? Okay, so 5 crimes were reported on my block. So, this restaurant was inspected and got a score of 89. So, this building, is changed electrical contractors. Well, the so what, of course, doesn't come very often from dry government data. The so what comes from, so I don't like that building. I don't think that we should have that building in the way that they're going to use it on my block. So I'm going to join a block club to help reduce crime, or to organize a hangout party. I think they call it positive loitering. So that's the stuff that's interesting to us, and that's the stuff that I think that is a really great answer to the question: what do we do with data? We do it to help make decisions and to help try to make things better.
Okay. And Jay, you mentioned that there's something like 60 apps that have been built on San Francisco's open data sets. Give me an example, 1 or 2 apps that you think really showcase what making this data possible has resulted in.
If you look at most of the apps in San Francisco, they try to solve problems that people experience every day. It's a so what question. What's the importance of this data? And majority of the applications are around transit, because people care about transit at a local level. And if you look at it, it's at least over a dozen apps in every which way possible. You can think of it on Blackberries, iPhones, Androids, websites. You can text and get some information back. So people have really thought about different ways of getting this information. And it's possible because we've invested in GPS on all our buses, And we're sharing real-time data with the public on how to do that. And many cities actually don't do that for whatever reason. They think they control the data, they own the data, and that's something that they want to control that experience. But we found, putting that data out there, you've got a much better experience with our customers than we could do ourselves, and at no cost to government. And so I'll give an example. Route C, if you're on the street corner, you can make that decision whether you hop on a cab or grab a cup of coffee before you get into your bus. And that's important. For most people, knowing when the next bus is coming is really important to people. Another one that's a little bit more wonky is how SF votes, and that's taking voting data and it's applying kind of visualization, mapping, and I recommend if you live in San Francisco, check it out. You can see the patterns, and they combine it with census data as well. So you're mashing up, based on what kind of ethnic group you are, or what your income is, whether you're renting or buying, and what your votes are. So it's a rich set of data that's being visualized for people, and I think it goes back to streaming this raw data out is it's great, but it's not useful until somebody creates information out of it. Somebody does the analysis out of it. And I think that's where kind of the Web 2.0 community and our technology community has stepped in. Journalists have stepped in. Artists have stepped in. We're seeing education stepping in. A whole bunch of areas that we couldn't even imagine are actually going in to this space.
Great, thanks. So there has been, across the country and the world, as we've already talked about, movements to open up data. But what kind of data isn't available yet? And how can we get that out there? And what do you think would happen if we did?
Yeah, let me dive into that a little bit. And it embellishes a little bit of the comment that I made a few moments ago, which is there's still a fairly large disconnect between the systems of record and the open data sites that governmental organizations host to make their data available. And the real transformation that we see take place is when an organization realizes that the most efficient way for them to disseminate their data is to update the workflow so that as the transactional records are created, that data just flows through automatically into the data portal sites. So today it's still a fairly manual, fairly laborious process to export or extract data from some system of record. But then we're seeing more and more things like New York City, which has a checkbook application coming online later this week, which will allow any of the residents of the city of New York, or for that matter around the world, to be able to analyze and sort and search and filter the city's checkbook. Those are the kinds of things that are only possible when you start to think about updating the underlying transactional systems so that they can share their data in real time.
I'll add to that and say that what we're missing here in San Francisco is data that is around accountability. As taxpayers going back, we don't have a good sense of where our dollars are going, and that's a problem. We have more insight into public companies than public government, and this is our data. As taxpayers, this is our information, and yet we don't have access to it. And I think that's something that the public needs to recognize is your right, and we should be doing a lot more to get that data out there. If for nothing else, then it's our responsibility to you as taxpayers. Some of the things that we're doing in San Francisco is we're trying to do that transactional data. So we're actually investing in ETL type tools to get data out there, make it easy. We also have legislation that when we look at new technology systems, that inherent in that purchase is a way for us to share that data with you guys. And that's really important. If we don't make that investment up front, we're not going to have the budget down the road to say, yeah, let's share that data. So I think it needs to be kind of part of the culture. It needs to be part of the procurement process. It needs to be part of kind of everyday data management in cities and state government.
I'd agree on this mean, to answer your question about what data is generally not available, the spending is a big one. In Chicago, I had a side project, and it's kind of odd because it's easy to say that data is not available, but in Chicago, the city of Chicago has a website that publishes all of the contracts, contractors, subcontractors, and payments for the city government. But it's a very difficult website to navigate, and it's impossible to do upshots and make connections among subcontractors and finding out exactly what's really going on. So a friend and I scraped that website and put it on another one called citypayments.org. And from there, it's more easily searchable, and reporters have been able to then go in and do some of that analysis. And then the second thing, even more importantly, it's not about types. It's just that it's unevenly distributed. I think that we could have an expectation as citizens that data is published in the normal course of events. And the fact is that data is generated in the normal course of events. And I know, Kevin, in the course of your work, lots of times people will talk about getting a data set out there. And that data set exists. Or it's generated, reports are generated on a weekly basis. When I go to city governments and I say, hey, I would like, every building permit that you published yesterday, they'll say, well, what's the address? And I'll say, well, all of them, all of the addresses. And then, they act like I'm crazy, but that's a noble thing. Right? I mean, they have these workflows. They've made enormous investments in really quality software. It's just that expectation of publication to the web and its availability is not built in the systems.
I would also add, just to go I think the government data is critical, obviously, in transparency and everything like that, but I'd like to go a step beyond and say, cultural heritage information is also something that's really important, helps round out that picture of who we are and where we are today, and puts that into context. And I think that Dan, you really touched on the community that's being built around data. That's something that we've seen in the library, archives, museums world with things like look back maps, which you start to find, just niche groups of train enthusiasts or, whatever it is, Civil War people, whatever that may be. But that adds to our understanding of who we are today. And those numbers are critical, obviously, in terms of translating that. But the whole opening, data within the cultural heritage sector is also an exciting piece of it to me.
And John, you've been doing a lot of work with linked open data. So since we're in a room of so many people who are innovating and creating new standards, talk a little bit about what linked open data could do to make accessing and using data easier.
Well, I think what we've started to look at within the libraries, archives, museums sector is essentially how linked open data is the first step for us.
And can you give a quick background of linked open data for people who might not be familiar?
Sure. I mean, linked data is basically a protocol of sharing data on the web. You keep it as simple as that, basically, so that once you have that open data, that you can start to create vocabulary and decide that you're talking about the same things, be able to search and work with that data in a web environment. I mean, to keep it as simple as that. So within the libraries and archives, they've been trying to figure out ways to share and link data, for 20, 30 years now. Yep. And so the excitement here is that we have the possibility of doing that in a way that's shareable and open within the World Wide Web context. It becomes much more useful from a developer standpoint, which is important to us. And that's where you start to see these projects like the Civil War Data 150, where we try and look at one very basic vocabulary, the regiments and battles of the Civil War. So if you have a book about the Michigan 7th Regiment, you'll be able to find pictures of that if we've tagged or geotagged or made that association with that regiment in the Library of Congress collections. And that's what we're starting to look for. And the exciting thing there is you can start to look across sectors, look across collections, and free what we've been struggling with for so long, and that's silo collections. So that's essentially what we're looking at.
Great, thanks. On the back end, I wanted to go back to a comment Vivek made in his keynote address about the opportunities for startups to replace and displace a lot of the legacy carriers, or the legacy systems, rather. So what are some of the reasons why legacy systems suck? And what do you think are some opportunities for, say, the people in this room to replace them and make the world a better place?
I can start because at Every Block, we use a lot of those legacy systems. We scrape, web databases that high quality programmers like to make fun of, and I've grown to really respect, frankly, the work of those people, because we're talking about decades of, especially in the GIS world. I think that they've had their heads on straight for longer than most, right? It's because that was one of the easiest things for me to find. When I call up the IT department at a municipality and say, can I get all of your shape files for the entire city, they say, yeah, what's your email address? Or, okay, here's the URL. And I found that was it was a given. And I think that we need to get to that spot in all of the other sort of subsets. But so why don't they work for us? And the answer is because when they were built, they weren't trying to solve the problems that we have. And they weren't trying to, work for the use cases that we currently have. But the fact is that those systems are running right now and doing great things. So it's a matter of being able to use that data and to present it into like all these formats that you guys do at Socrata. I mean, you rely on all of these kind of brittle, well, they're not brittle, they're working really well, but inflexible systems that actually provide wonderful results when you have a layer on top, which is, these companies like ours that want to do stuff with it.
So I'll give some examples. In San Francisco, I think a lot of it's cultural. There's no incentive to actually take risk and use open source technology, right? And so people are going to go back to what's safe and working with traditional players like Oracle, IBM, Microsoft. That's a safe route. No one's going to, fire you for making that decision. I know that's kind of a hackneyed statement, but if you go to something like Drupal or another solution that's not well established, people are going to start asking questions. Why are you doing this? And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is actually demonstrate that we can be a lean government, just like Silicon Valley. We can lower costs, we can get speed to market, and we can get a better product as well. So my team doesn't have a budget, and we've been able to produce a lot because we've avoided the procurement process by using open source technology. We've been able to tweak what we do using open source technology, and we get to a better outcome that way as well. So I think the legacy option is the easy option and the option that you're not going to get fired for. So we need to start asking as citizens that our government start behaving and acting more like private sector in that regard, that we need to innovate in those areas.
I'd like to add to both Dan and Jay's thoughts briefly. So Dan makes the really important point that most of these systems of record were not designed with the consumption experience in mind. They were designed in order to run the business of government. And one of the important things that we try to work with our customer organizations on is this idea that you want to leave those systems in their business process optimized formats, but you don't want to neglect the consumption optimized formats that other folks need when they're accessing your data, whether that's accessing it interactively over the web or accessing it interactively through a mobile device or accessing it programmatically through a modern RESTful API, or as John might advocate accessing it through RDF or some other semantic technology. So it's important to think about how the consumption experience of your data differs from the transactional experience of your systems. Secondarily, with regard to why is there so much cruft and why do so many of the vendors in this space suck? And the reality is procurement is a very difficult process for most organizations to deal with. And you know, I don't know if the folks in this room know much about Socrata, but we're 15 or 20 folks venture-backed up in Seattle, and you know, we have been slogging it out in this space for a couple of years now, and virtually every jurisdiction is different in terms of how do we register ourselves to be able to sell our services to this organization, to things like what union rules are in place to prevent this governmental organization from adopting a SaaS model. There are all sorts of little weird nuances that I think most innovative startups just say, forget it, I'll just stick with the commercial world. And so, you know, what that ends up leaving is this environment of gigantic legacy laggards serving governmental organizations. And so, you know, this is an open data conference and a data conference, but I'm hopeful that pretty soon there'll be a procurement conference so that we can talk about those kinds of things as well.
Well, let's talk about that really just a little bit more. Is procurement and government funding potentially a new big source of revenue for next generation data startups?
I think so. I mean, the barriers to entry are huge. So the only players who can actually participate in government are the ones that have scale, the ones that can actually, you know every CIO in every city. And that just doesn't work for startups. So what we need to do is rethink the platform. How do we actually procure in a more intelligent way so that innovators, startups, people who are one or two people can actually participate? And so why not use the marketplace as a way, right? We've solved that problem on the consumer side. We haven't been able to solve that the kind of procurement challenge on government side. So for me, I think that's one of the next big things for government is to be smarter, to tap into our community better by giving people like yourselves the ability to sell your services and ideas to government. Right now, you can't do that. Very few VCs back startups who are focused on local government or government. And why is that? Because it's nearly impossible to actually sell to government. So people spend millions of dollars to try to sell to government, and those costs are absorbed by government. So it's a downward cycle, and we need to change that. And I think there is the potential to do that.
Is San Francisco working on that right now?
You know, we've been thinking about it. You know, there's a whole bunch of players out there that do this, like Odesk, and there's a marketplace that we can create. So we're working actually with an organization called Living Labs, and they're trying to solve this problem in Europe. And you know, it's a huge market, trillions of dollars of spend in local government, and yet companies don't have access to that. Very few companies do, and we need to change that so that people like Kevin at Socrata don't have to slog through it, that it's a much more efficient marketplace for access.
I'm going to give one more governmental high five, actually, on this, because I do hope that there is innovation in the procurement. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I think that, it has to get done. But I would also say that, I live in Chicago, and we're based in Chicago, and I come from Chicago, and there are a lot of inane, crazy procurement rules in Chicago, and they're based on the fact that people have lied, cheated, and stolen from us, right? So that we have lawsuits, and we have federal decrees, we have the Shackman decree, we have a federal hiring monitor who sits in City Hall, and those are odd, and those are really hard to navigate. But there's a reason for it. It's because there's corruption. So we gotta count for all of those things that actually are really worthwhile.
You made a comment earlier about one of the major problems being culture, particularly a culture that's resistant to sharing, resistant to openness, and oftentimes resistant to the idea of data being public. What are some of the specific things that can be done to change that culture? And maybe, John, you could talk about that since you deal with a lot of institutions and libraries.
Yeah, from an institutional perspective, and I'm sure this is the same in the government space as it is in the cultural heritage space, but essentially what we're looking at is a paradigm shift that's happening. So you have kind of an older school regime that's, our job is to preserve this data, this metadata, these assets. But we've got a younger generation, not necessarily age-wise, but technology-minded, that sees the possibility of getting data out to where people are going to use it and access it, gives them the opportunity to improve that metadata. When we talk about from a cultural heritage standpoint, it means geotagging archival photos, something like that. You know, you see the same kind of thing in the government world as well. So there's a distinct cultural shift, I think, that's starting to take place there, where there's a realization that for very little cost, you can bring these, bring this information to people and actually get return on that. I don't know if would you agree that there's a cultural shift that's been happening? Or?
I think there is. In San Francisco, I got a lot of resistance to opening up data, and unfortunately, you sometimes need champions and organizations to make that first step. But once you've got the inertia going, you start seeing people and their mindsets changing. So I think it's becoming more commonplace in San Francisco. From a cultural standpoint, I think the best thing we can do is actually show the value of sharing data with the public. So when journalists are supportive, when app developers are solving problems for department heads that they were trying to solve themselves. And a great example is here in San Francisco, our public works department manages the street sweeping schedule. And everyone hates that, kind of time when you have to move your car so that the street sweeper can come. And so they wanted to build an iPhone app. Well, I told them, why don't you release that data, your schedule, and put it out there and see what happens? And they did. And, first month, nothing happened. And so they're like, oh, maybe I need to spend $40,000 on developing an iPhone app. And I said, no, actually, just wait a little bit or incentivize the community but through a competition or some way. Well, in second month, 2 apps came out and is solving that problem for San Franciscans. They can get alerted when the street sweeper is coming. So that's solving the problem for department head, and it's now changing people's mindsets about the value of sharing data. Because right now, the kind of way they perceive things is that this is kind of a gotcha type of mentality that journalists and people have been traditionally trying to hold government accountable, so why share data? It's going to hold you even more accountable. So it's changing that slowly.
So I'll echo Jay's sentiments about the culture is changing by way of 2 points. One is earlier this year, there was an open government data benchmark study released. This was a partnership between Sunlight Foundation, Personal Democracy Forum, David Eves in Canada, Socrata, and a number of other open data advocacy groups. And one of the surprising data points that came out of that was how widespread the support was within government to share data. Now, it is worth mentioning that there's a slight disagreement between the sharing of data and the sharing of dirty metadata. By far, the embarrassment that we deal with from a cultural standpoint is, hey, I'm totally ready to put my data online, but I'd like a little bit of time to clean up the metadata around it first. And so there's a little bit of angst that we see our customers go through. Secondarily, to kind of echo Jay's thoughts, the State of Oregon launched an open data portal in October of last year. It was a centrally organized project from the Department of Information Services, and they basically asked state agencies to voluntarily participate. They called the Secretary of State's office and they said, well, we're not sure, but okay, we'll put this one data set online which has locations of voting locations within the state of Oregon. And this was in the fall, right before the election. And the interesting thing was somebody built an app so that you could use your iPhone to go and find the closest location to where you are. The Secretary of State's office said to the Department of Information Services, thank you very much, you just saved us $40,000 because we were going to have somebody build that app. So kind of interesting real-world example of the value of putting your data online.